Hi everyone, my name is Omar Boom. I am an associate professor in anthropology and NELC. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. First of all, thank you for coming such a busy time at the end of the quarter. But I'm really honored to have and happy to have our speaker for the day, Eric Calderwood, with us today. He's definitely one of the, I would argue, as a North Africanist, also interested in Muslim Spain, is probably one of the academic forces that drive in conversations about Muslim Spain and North Africa today, from reinterpreting that history. And I think if you haven't read his work, I would really advise you to look especially at his book on colonial Andalus. But Eric is an associate professor in the program in comparative and world literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he also holds faculty appointments in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, the program in Medieval Studies, the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and the program in Jewish Culture and Society. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 2011. His research explores the political uses of past in modern Mediterranean culture, with a particular emphasis on Spanish and North African literature and film. His book, Colonial and Andalus, it's a great book. It's really an excellent book. Colonial Andalus, Spain and the Making of Modern Moroccan Culture, was published by Harvard University in 2018 and just recently won the 2019 Carl Brown Ames Book Prize in North African Studies and received honorable mention for the Nikki Keddie Book Award for the Middle Eastern Studies Association. He's published in many articles in many academic journals. I won't go in, I don't have enough time to list them, but all of them relate to his work on Muslim Spain and North Africa, mostly northern Morocco. He has contributed essays and commentary to such venues as NPR, the BBC, Foreign Policy, and today he's going to be talking about the future of Al-Andalus, so please join me in welcoming Eric.
See if I can manage to do this without losing all of my papers. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Omar, for that really lovely introduction, and thanks so much to all of you for coming. I know, even though it doesn't look like it outside, I left snow in Illinois yesterday, and so this doesn't look like December to me, but I do know that the calendar says it is, which means it's a very busy time of the year. I appreciate you guys making time to come out. I want to thank our sponsors, the Center for Near Eastern Studies and the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, for sponsoring this event. It's a real thrill and an honor to be here and to have this chance to share my work with you. So I'm going to start today by talking about a story that some of you might remember. In 2010, a controversy erupted over plans to build an Islamic community center in Lower Manhattan, about 2 blocks away from the site of the 9/11 attacks. Opponents dubbed this controversial center the Ground Zero Mosque. But the Muslim cleric behind the project, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, called the center Cordoba House. The name, he wrote, referred to the Cordoba Caliphate in what is now Spain, during which Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in what was then the most enlightened, pluralistic, and tolerant society on earth. Excuse me, see if I can arrange my papers here. So those of you who are familiar with Iberian history will know that Imam Faisal is referring here to the Umayyad Caliphate of 10th century Cordoba. This is one of the pinnacles of 8 centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. And in particular, he's drawing upon a very specific idea about Cordoba. He's drawing upon the widespread perception that Cordoba was a place of exceptional tolerance, where the three Abrahamic faiths coexisted peacefully. Today, at a time of increasing anxiety about the place of Islam in the United States and in Europe, Cordoba has become a comforting symbol of a past and perhaps a future in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews could live together peacefully. Now, this idea that Imam Faisal is working with, Cordoba's symbolic association with the ideal of tolerance, it's just one of many competing ideas that circulate today about medieval Muslim Iberia, known in Arabic as Al-Andalus, which is the term I'll be using from now on. In contemporary culture, the memory of Al-Andalus is like a Swiss Army knife, a kind of varied kit of tools ready to address any problem or question. Al-Andalus is the name of a major shopping mall in Saudi Arabia, a publishing house in Israel, and a cinema in the West Bank. Al-Andalus is a hallmark of Moroccan national identity and a major driver of tourism to Spain. Al-Andalus, as I've said, is a symbol of intercultural coexistence, and at the same time, it's also a rallying cry for right-wing groups opposed to the arrival of Muslim immigrants in Europe. In short, Al-Andalus has proven incredibly malleable and useful for politicians, writers, scholars, and artists all around the world. For the past several years, I've been thinking about this, about the cultural afterlife of Al-Andalus, an afterlife that cuts across, traversing national, religious, and linguistic borders. And along the way, my interest in the modern legacy of Al-Andalus has taken the form of two books. The first one, Omar mentioned, Colonial Al-Andalus, was published last year by Harvard University Press. That book uncovered what I found to be a surprising story of collaboration between Spanish colonialism, Spanish fascism, and Moroccan anti-colonial nationalism. These strange bedfellows, which we shouldn't think go together easily, they came together in 20th century Morocco to celebrate Spain and Morocco's shared Andalusi heritage and to help make Al-Andalus a hallmark of Moroccan national identity. So one of the paradoxes that lies at the center of that book is that the legacy of Al-Andalus served both to justify Spanish colonialism in Morocco and to define the Moroccan national culture that would eventually supplant colonial rule. So in other words, Al-Andalus was both a tool of colonialism and also a symbol of Moroccan nationalism and anti-colonial resistance. My book dwells on this paradox, and more broadly, it tries to show that many of the ideas that we have today about Al-Andalus are in fact not medieval legacies, but are instead products of the colonial encounter between Europe and North Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have about that book in the Q&A. Today, though, I'm going to be presenting some new work. I'm going to be focusing on my current book project, which is tentatively titled The Future of Al-Andalus. This project, and I'm not going to talk right now about this image, but I'm happy to come back to it. For those who don't read Arabic, it's called Cordoba Station. It's like a Manhattan station, and it's by an interesting artist I talk about in the book. So this project explores representations of Al-Andalus in contemporary literature, film, television, music, and tourism from contexts spanning Spain, Morocco, Egypt, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and the United States. The book's premise is pretty simple. It's that contemporary claims about Al-Andalus generally tell us more about our current moment than they do about the medieval past. But more broadly with this project, I'm trying to challenge a tradition of scholarship that has treated Al-Andalus as a symbol of tolerance, as a symbol of cross-cultural understanding, while at the same time generally ignoring the voices of contemporary Arab and Muslim artists and scholars who are talking about Al-Andalus. I'm also aiming to ask larger questions about the political uses of history, such as why and how do some historical moments like Al-Andalus become useful and usable in different cultural contexts? How does the past travel across time? Can anachronism be benign or perhaps even desirable? These are some of the questions that are driving the book. Ultimately, what I'm arguing is that I believe that the story of Al-Andalus is in fact not about learning to tolerate difference, but rather about learning to tolerate contradiction. Al-Andalus means many different things to many different people, and for us, I think the ethical challenge is to keep all of these disparate meanings in mind without having one trump the others. So there's an element of kind of multi-directionality here, to cite my friend Michael. In this sense, Al-Andalus is not, in my view, a blueprint for interfaith tolerance, but rather an invitation to a mode of cultural memory that is capacious enough to accommodate and even welcome competing claims on the past. Before I turn to a few specific examples from that project, I'd like to say something about its title, The Future of Al-Andalus. The original title for this project was actually The Invention of Al-Andalus, and in fact, some of you who know my work might have read an article with that title. Over time, though, I've become dissatisfied with it, and one of the main reasons is how the title lands. As I've had the opportunity to present this work to a variety of different audiences, I've noticed that the word invention leads some people to assume that I'm making a sort of true or false claim, something along the lines of, Al-Andalus is fake, you've all been duped. That's not really what I meant by invention, but nonetheless, I don't want to introduce the project with a term that puts readers in a defensive posture. More importantly, I wanted to find a title that would help me to address what I see as a pretty common misperception in the scholarship on the modern afterlife of Al-Andalus. Much of the work on this topic, I think, leaves one with the impression that talking about Al-Andalus today is always a nostalgic, backward-looking enterprise. In contrast, at the heart of my project is the conviction that contemporary evocations of Al-Andalus are not just nostalgic glances toward the past, but are also vehicles for intervening in the present and even for imagining the future. In the cultural text that I discussed in the book, there are, of course, moments of nostalgia of looking back at Al-Andalus. But there's also, just as importantly, something that I would call an Andalus futurism, or perhaps a Janus-faced Andalus, with its feet planted in the present, one eye on the past, and another eye on the future. So I'm going to come back to this issue of the complex temporality of Al-Andalus toward the end of the talk. Now, though, I'd like to turn to some specific examples from my project. And I'll talk, the first book that I wrote about the afterlife of Al-Andalus is it's an historical argument in the sense that it's about change over time. What I'm arguing in the book is that the ways that Moroccans wrote about, talked about, and understood their relationship to Al-Andalus changed as a result of European colonialism. This new project, the one I'm talking about today, doesn't really have that same historical arc. Instead, it's organized thematically. And in each chapter, I try to identify a specific cultural or political project that is appropriated in the memory of Al-Andalus, trace its genealogy, and talk about its politics. So in the book's introduction, that's kind of where I address the thing that most people already know about Al-Andalus, though hopefully I still have some new things to say about it. This idea of Al-Andalus as a place of tolerance. Where does that idea come from? What are some of its surprising roots? How does it trace us back to some moments that we might feel really proud to be associated with, and other moments that are a little bit more tricky, like fascism and colonialism? But in the remaining chapters, I kind of take a turn away from this Al-Andalus as tolerance paradigm, and I try to talk about lesser-known uses of Al-Andalus. Things like how Al-Andalus has been used to talk about ethnicity, gender, feminism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, immigration, and so on. In the book, there's kind of chapters for each of those different projects, but much of the remaining material for today's talk is going to come from my chapter, which is the first chapter of the book, called The Arab Al-Andalus. This is kind of the most long-lasting historical imaginary that the book looks at. It has a longer historical reach than the Andalus as tolerance story, and I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean by the Arab Al-Andalus. And at the very end of the talk, I'm going to discuss one quick example from the Palestinian Al-Andalus to talk about how Al-Andalus operates in the context of Israel-Palestine. So as a transition to this next section of my talk, I'd like to show you a clip of a performance from the 1960s. Fingers crossed for those of you who are here, there might or might not be a performance from the 1960s, otherwise I will try to sing it. performance in question, and this is why you want to hear it, is in fact not from me, but is by the Lebanese superstar Fayrouz, arguably the most famous, or one of the most famous Arab singers of the 20th century. And the thing that I'm about to show you, it's a clip from a performance that took place, that Fayrouz gave in Kuwait in 1966. And that performance took place at none other than Cinema El Andalus, which was the name of Kuwait's premier movie house and concert venue. So let's take a look at how that performance began. So once again, this is Fayrouz, Kuwait, 1966, Cinema El Andalus. Let there be sound.
زادك الغيث إذا الغيث هما يا زمان الوصل بالأنجم.
Can't have it all, my friend.
لم يكن وصلك إلا حلما في الكرى أو خلسة المختلس.
Okay, well, we got sound. We didn't get image. We're back here. That's okay. I'm actually only going to talk about the sound for this clip. The next clip has more interesting visuals, so hopefully we can get them both at that point. I just want to briefly describe, I was going to say what we saw, but what we heard. Because actually, luckily, I was mostly going to talk about what we heard. So this is the very beginning of the concert, okay? We imagine ourselves, we're Kuwait, 1966, lights go down, orchestra strikes up a tremolo, and all of a sudden this voice from offstage recites these two lines of poetry. May the rain cloud shower you when the rain cloud pours. This is what he was saying. O time of union in Al-Andalus, Ya Zaman al-Wasli bil-Andalusi. Union with you was but a dream in slumber or the deception of a deceiver. Does anyone recognize this poem? I don't know if there are any Al-Andalus fans out there. Okay, well, it's a really famous poem from Al-Andalus by Ibn al-Khatib. He's a poet from 14th century Muslim Granada. And this particular poem, which is one of the most famous from Al-Andalus, enjoyed a revival in the 1960s, precisely because Fayrouz set it to music and performed it on her album titled Andalusiyat, whose title roughly translates as Songs from Al-Andalus. This was one of her biggest hits. It was released in 1966. And the Ibn al-Khatib poem from 14th century Granada gave the lyrics to its most famous track. So, the same year that she released this album, she went on a tour. That tour included her first ever concert in Kuwait. And I'm doing some research on that concert right now. And at the end, we already saw that concert began with this kind of disembodied voice reading this poem from the time of Al-Andalus, yearning for this time of union with Al-Andalus. And Fayrouz then comes back to that poem at the end of the first act and kind of brings the house down by performing her famous rendition of Ibn al-Khatib's poem. So let's look at that part of the performance, hopefully with both lyrics and sound, so you can see what this performance of Al-Andalus looked like. Hold on, they're already going. Try this again. My apologies for technical difficulties. That's okay. I can do without. Well.
Could we listen to it first and then watch it? But if you're not in full screen, do it in full screen.
You want to try it with full screen mode or?
We're doing full screen mode because this works, but you just went to full screen mode.
Oh.
So if you go.
Okay. Hold on. Okay, so we are seeing these dancing in what is supposed to be the medieval marketplace of Cordoba. this entire operation, I think, would be more impressive if you could actually see this music performance with it, but maybe we can get that up at some point in the Q&A. What I like about this clip is, so this is the end of the concert's first act, and basically how it ends is the male members in the chorus shout out, "O time of union in Al-Andalus." The female members of the chorus shout out, "O time of union in Al-Andalus." Fairuz chimes in, "O time of union in Al-Andalus." And then they all step forward, throwing their fists up into the air, and they shout, "In Al-Andalus, Bil-Andalusi," and the crowd just goes absolutely wild. So I wanted to show you a little bit of the ways in which kind of performance of Al-Andalus operates in popular culture in this context of 1966 Kuwait. Hopefully we can come back and find this archival clip again. But I kind of want to stop and see if I can draw attention to the intricate web of references that underpin this scene. So we have Fairuz, who is, if you don't know, a Lebanese Christian performer, singing a poem by Ibn al-Khatib, a Muslim poet from 14th century Granada, in Cinema Al-Andalus, a Kuwaiti venue named after a place that is on the other side of the Mediterranean and a time that predated the creation of the modern state of Kuwait by several centuries. So my question is, what is making this stick? What system of memory and meaning makes it possible for all of these different threads to cohere into an intelligible web? It's clearly not a system based on geographic or temporal proximity. We're in Kuwait in 1966. Nor is it one based on nation-state identification or religious affiliation. We have Christians and Muslims. We have Kuwaitis and Lebanese. Fairuz has this multinational orchestra. Instead, it seems to me that what's at work here is a system of meaning that's made possible by the notion of Arabness. And by Arabness, I mean an identity that's rooted in a common language and in the perception of a common ethnic and cultural heritage. A heritage that encompasses Arabs of different faiths, so Fairuz and her Muslim majority audience here, as well as Arabs in different contexts, everywhere from medieval Granada to the modern Gulf states. So as it turns out, this notion of Al-Andalus functioning on the hinge of Arabness, this performance that we're seeing by Fairuz, it participates in a long tradition of cultural commemoration, a tradition that traces its roots back to the time of Al-Andalus itself. Since the medieval period, roughly the 8th century, until the present, many Arab writers and artists have cast Al-Andalus as an Arab and Arabic phenomenon rather than a Muslim one. What I mean is that they've identified Al-Andalus predominantly in ethnic and linguistic terms rather than in religious ones. This particular view of Andalusi history champions the period in which the Umayyads, an Arab dynasty that originated in Damascus, ruled Al-Andalus with Cordoba as their capital. The Arab-centric view of Al-Andalus, it emerged in conjunction with the foundation of the Umayyad state in Al-Andalus, roughly in the 8th century, and it has survived intermittently until the present. Since the 19th century, and this is the piece I'm going to be focusing on right now in the talk, this view has generally associated Al-Andalus with the Levant and with the Greco-Roman heritage, while distancing Al-Andalus from North Africa and Islam. So in other words, it's a view that has served to make Al-Andalus whiter, less religious, and more compatible with Europe. By that I mean more compatible with the cultural tradition that imagines a kind of direct continuity between Greco-Roman antiquity and European modernity. In chapter 1 of my book, I survey some of the key moments in the development of this historical imaginary, which I'm calling the Arab Al-Andalus. How did Al-Andalus come to become understood predominantly as an Arab phenomenon, and what political needs does that serve in different contexts? Along the way, I try to show how debates about Al-Andalus have often intersected with debates about ethnic identities in North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Middle East. Today, I'm going to focus on one of the key junctures in this story, the resurgence of interest in Al-Andalus that took place in Arab intellectual circles in Egypt and the Levant in the late 19th and early 20th century, as part of a cultural movement commonly known as the Nakhda, which is sometimes translated as the Arab Renaissance. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on this guy, Georgi Zaidan, a prolific novelist, journalist, and scholar who played an important role in reviving popular interest in Al-Andalus at the turn of the 20th century. Now, Zaidan was born to a Greek Orthodox family in Beirut in 1861, but he spent most of his adult life working as a journalist and media man in Cairo. Although he made important contributions to several fields, he's best known today for his historical novels, which were wildly popular during his lifetime and which continue to be printed until the present day. Now, despite the immense popularity of Zaidan's historical fiction, I mean, this guy was like the Tom Clancy or the Dan Brown of his day, they've really not received much attention, either in cultural histories of the Middle East or in literary histories of modern Arabic literature. And I can say a bit more in the Q&A about why Zaidan, despite his popularity, has kind of fallen through the cracks. For now, though, I'd merely like to suggest that we as scholars would do well to pay attention to Zaidan, because through his novels, it was really his novels that introduced generations of readers to the major figures and events of Arab history. And in so doing, they helped to create a popular historical consciousness among readers of the Arabic language, a historical consciousness of what Arabness was, what it meant to be an Arab. Zaidan would commonly refer to himself, he refers to himself in a few points in his writings as a katib am, a phrase that has been translated as non-specialist writer, though I think that an even better translation would be public writer, in the way that we say public humanities today, kind of public-facing writer. Zaidan defined the katib am as, and I'm quoting him, the servant of the nation and the guardian of its instruction. The nation to which he refers here is not Egypt or Syria, but rather the Arab nation, a construct that Zaidan himself helped to build. Zaidan would speak of his pan-Arab audience as, quote, the nation of language, or, quote, the Arabic linguistic society. Those are both quotes from the same text that I have up on the slide. For Zaidan, the Arabic language was a force, and perhaps the only force, that could forge a common identity among Arabs of different faiths and from different places and times. This view is likely informed by Zaidan's own experience as a Levantine Christian immigrant writing in Muslim-majority Egypt at a time when Egyptian nationalism was on the rise. So this is a man who had a vested stake in saying there's something that binds us together. And indeed, Zaidan and many other Christian Arab intellectuals of his generation asserted a place for themselves in Egyptian and Levantine society by advocating for a pan-Arab identity based on a common language and cultural heritage rather than a common religion. This vision of a pan-Arab identity is what comes to the fore in Zaidan's historical novels. These novels are commonly referred to as the novels of the history of Islam, but it's really a misnomer because it's mostly the novels of those periods of Islam that are dominated by Arabs. It's a much chunkier but a much more accurate title. And this dynamic is particularly comes into view in a trilogy of novels that Zaidan wrote about Al-Andalus in the first half of the 20th century. So he was a famous historical novelist, famous for trying to kind of come up with this notion of Arabness and a pan-Arab identity, and one of the vehicles that he did this was through a trilogy of novels that were widely read at the beginning of the 20th century. The first part of this trilogy, Fath al-Andalus, the conquest of Al-Andalus, tells the story of the events leading up to the Muslim invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 711, focusing on the political discord and palace intrigue that led to the demise of Visigoth rule in Iberia. Zaidan's second Andalus-themed novel, Shal wa Abdurrahman, Charles and Abdurrahman, follows the campaign of the Arab commander Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi, at the time a governor of Al-Andalus, into today's France, culminating with the defeat of Abdurrahman's army in the Battle of Poitiers in 732. I'm going to come back to that novel. And Zaidan's third and final novel set in Al-Andalus is called Abdurrahman al-Nasir. It celebrates the cultural splendor of Cordoba during the reign of the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Rahman al-Nasir, who ruled from 912 to 961 of the Common Era. So the first thing I want to note about Zaidan's trilogy is that it only covers the period in which Al-Andalus was under the control of Arab rulers with roots in Syria. So this is really the Umayyad, his trilogy is Al-Andalus Umayyad edition. In other words, Zaidan's Andalus ends in the 10th century, before the decline of the Umayyad Caliphate, and in so doing effectively leaves aside 500 more years of Andalusi history. You know, mind you, there was still Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula until 1492. But Zaidan really saw the period of Arab Umayyad rule as both the essence and the apogee of Al-Andalus. And he would speak quite explicitly to this point in another work that he wrote at the same time as he was writing this trilogy. So this quote I'm going to show right now is from his multi-volume History of Islamic Civilization, which was published in the beginning of the 20th century at the same time as his novels about Al-Andalus. And I quote, Al-Andalus reached its greatest glory during the days of Abdul Rahman al-Nasir, who died in the year 350 of the Hijrah. Arabs were at the forefront of the state and were people of ethnic solidarity, possessing stature and influence because the Umayyads were strongly attached to the Arabs, as we have previously said. When the Slavs and Berbers seized the posts and jobs, the might of the Arabs gradually became weak. What I want to draw attention to here is that Zaidan very explicitly narrates the kind of rise and fall of Al-Andalus in ethnic terms. In this passage, as in his novels, Arabness is really the foundation upon which the glory of Al-Andalus is built. This is an idea that plays out in all three of the novels in the Andalus trilogy, but it's probably most explicit and pronounced in the second installment, Shal wa Abdul Rahman, Charles and Abdul Rahman. That novel, as I've already said, follows the campaign of an Arab commander, Abdul Rahman al-Rafiqi, into today's France, culminating in his defeat at the Battle of Poitiers. That defeat marked the end of Islam's expansion into medieval Europe. But in the novel, the characters who stand in the way of Abdul Rahman's victory are in fact not the Christian Franks, but rather the Berbers, or indigenous North Africans, who fight in Abdul Rahman's army. So in other words, the novel blames the Berbers for the failure of Muslim forces to establish a permanent foothold in today's France. Not surprisingly then, the novel features many moments of eventually frustrated but attempted alliances between Christians and Muslims, and the novel's villain is not a Christian but is instead a Berber, a Muslim Berber commander whose name is Bustam. I'm going to read the narrator's first description of Bustam because I think that it illustrates Zaidan's treatment of non-Arab characters, as well as his emphasis on the threat that non-Arab groups pose to the spirit of Al-Andalus. And I quote from Zaidan's novel. Among them was a Berber commander named Bustam. He and his tribe had only converted to Islam out of greed for profit, plunder, booty, and the like. He was strong-bodied and ill-tempered. Anyone who laid eyes on him would shudder at the sight of him on account of his huge head, his wide face, his enormous nose, and his inflated nostrils. To say nothing of his oily color, the harsh crudeness on display in his entire appearance, and his thick lips of the darkest night, suggesting lewd pleasures. So first of all, this passage asserts that North African Berbers only converted to Islam out of greed and a desire for plunder. This is an idea that surfaces frequently in the novel, including the novel's culminating scene when Abdul Rahman's Berber soldiers abandon him right in the middle of the Battle of Poitiers so that he can rush back and protect their war booty. But what I find most striking about this description is, in fact, not the kind of weird comments about the sincerity of his faith, but rather the passage's attention to Bustam's physical attributes and the passage's reliance on racial stereotypes. Put bluntly, the description Africanizes Bustam, attributing to him features that are commonly associated with people of African descent, such as a dark complexion, a wide face, and thick lips. Furthermore, these physical attributes, they're not neutral. They're quite explicitly associated with moral flaws, such as lewdness, crudeness, and an ill temper. To just take a step back here, it bears noting that Zaidan, before publishing his Andalus trilogy, had in fact shown a sustained interest in physiognomy, phrenology, and other related European race sciences. In fact, his interest in European race science culminated in the publication of a little-known work. No Zaydan scholars really want to touch this thing, but it's out there. His book on the modern science of physiognomy, whose cover page promised readers a guide to, quote, judging people's character, ability, talents, and varieties of actions from the shape of their limbs. In fact, Zaydan cites this very work in the footnotes to his 3 Andalus novels. So returning to Zaydan's description of the Berber commander Bustam, what I'm saying is that it illustrates Zaydan's adherence to the principles of 19th century race science, and in particular to the belief that the study of someone's physical features reveals truths about their underlying moral character. But also, and this is really the key point for my argument about the Arab al-Andalus, this passage is part of Zaydan's systematic effort to represent Berbers as racialized others who are culturally inferior to Arabs and who are threats to Arab civilization in al-Andalus. I'm going to see if I can pivot here from this passage to a larger point, because I'm trying to use this passage to signal a larger theme that runs through Zaydan's writings, and that is going to run through other writings that we're going to kind of see later in this talk and also in tomorrow's documentary. Zaydan's trilogy casts al-Andalus as a hub in a cultural network that bypasses Africa and connects the Western Mediterranean to the Eastern Mediterranean. His imagined geography places particular emphasis on the links between al-Andalus and the Levant, so roughly today's Syria, but it also highlights the links between al-Andalus and the Greco-Roman heritage. To illustrate this point, I'd like to look at another passage, and this one comes from the first novel in Zaydan's Andalus trilogy, The Conquest of Al-Andalus, or Fath al-Andalus. In that novel, Zaydan not only depicts the Muslim conquest of Al-Andalus as an Arab enterprise, he time and time again refers to it as the Arab conquest of Al-Andalus, even though it was famously led by a Berber commander, Tariq ibn Ziyad, but also, and more importantly for what I'm going to talk about right now, he depicts this conquest as the continuation of the Roman heritage. Now, this is important because in kind of the historiography of Al-Andalus, whether or not Al-Andalus is a kind of break with Europe, one of the main points here is, are Muslims compatible with the Western tradition, the Greco-Roman heritage, or not? And Zaydan is clearly on the side of, I'm going to write the Arab conquest of Al-Andalus into the history of Greco-Roman heritage and the Mediterranean tradition. To this point, he writes, the Goths, this is in a passage in which he's explaining why the Arabs were able to conquer Iberia, conquered Spain, but they were unable to substitute their language for Latin, as the Arabs were able to substitute Arabic for the languages in the areas that they conquered in the Eastern Roman kingdoms. In their conquests of former Roman kingdoms, the Goths and Arabs shared a lot in common, but it was the Arabs who managed to achieve something that the Goths did not. Building on the vestiges of Roman civilization, they managed to erect a new one that was uniquely their own. With the passing of generations, they managed to mold the various nations with whom they came into contact into a single nation that spoke a single language. The Goths, on the other hand, spent over 200 years in Spain and then departed without leaving a trace worthy of mention. First, this passage describes the creation of an Arab national identity predicated on the shared use of the Arabic language. Clearly an important thing for a guy who's trying to lead an Arabic language media empire that wants to communicate with Arabs all across the Arab world. That's Zaydan. More significantly, I think, the passage casts the expansion of Arab rule in the Mediterranean as the continuation of the Roman heritage, suggesting that the Arab civilization in Al-Andalus was built, and I quote, on the vestiges of Roman civilization. At work here is a historical narrative in which the Pax Romana passes the torch to the Pax Arabica, and in which Latin passes the torch to Arabic as the language of cultural prestige in the Mediterranean. Zaydan suggests that the Arabs are the heirs to the Romans in the sense that both peoples were able to forge an ecumenical national identity based on the shared use of a language. This passage is just one of many in Zaidan's novels in which Al-Andalus appears as the bridge that brought the Greco-Roman heritage into Europe, a process of cultural transmission that clearly includes the Arabs, but does not include North African Berbers or the other ethnic groups in Al-Andalus. Why am I harping on this? Well, I'm trying to strike a note of caution here, and this is going to come up again for those of you who do show up to tomorrow's documentary called The Ornament of the World, which I hope you will if you're interested in having a second day of Andalus talk. What I'm driving at is that modern celebrations of Al-Andalus are often predicated on a historical imaginary that reduces Al-Andalus to a stepping stone between classical antiquity and European modernity. They're also often linked implicitly or explicitly to claims of the ethnic and cultural superiority of Arabs over Berbers. Let me offer you another example just to show you that Zaidan is not an isolated case. And this example comes from something that's much more recent. It comes from Maria Rosa Menacal's book, The Ornament of the World, which is the inspiration for the documentary we're going to look at tomorrow. Menacal describes her book as, quote, an account of and tribute to the culture of tolerance brought to Europe by the Umayyads. Now remember that the Umayyads are the Arab dynasty originating in Damascus that ruled in the first few centuries of Al-Andalus. In Menacal's account, the enemies of this culture of tolerance are the North African Berber dynasties that rose to power in Al-Andalus after the fall of the Umayyads. And at various points in her book, Menacal refers to these Berber dynasties as fanatics, a term she used 5 times, fundamentalists, that gets 10 uses, and even barbarians. In other words, Menacal, like Zaidan, structures her account of Al-Andalus around the binary of enlightened Arabs and backward Berbers, and she also grafts that binary onto the lexicon of the post-9/11 war on terror, with its fanatics, fundamentalists, and so on. So all this begs the question, can Al-Andalus be rehabilitated as anything but a backdoor form of Eurocentrism? Is there any there? Is it nothing more than a way of celebrating Muslim and or Arab civilization insofar as we can insert it into Europe? The short answer is yes. I think there's more to it. I think this is not a dour story where it's like, bummer, Al-Andalus is Eurocentrism, let's all go home. But in order to get there, I think that we need to start looking in new places. I think we need to start looking at the work of contemporary Arab and Muslim writers, artists, and scholars who have offered visions that move beyond the dominant paradigms of Al-Andalus' tolerance or Al-Andalus as Arabness. As this quote from Menacal shows, these two dominant paradigms often converge and sustain each other. Arabs are tolerant, Islam is tolerant when it's ruled by Arabs. It's kind of circular system. But these two paradigms do not, of course, exhaust Al-Andalus as a potent cultural signifier. For that reason, what my book is trying to do is to identify and to trace the genealogy of other projects that have appropriated the legacy of Al-Andalus and used it to intervene in present-day debates, particularly in the 20th and 21st century Mediterranean. What are these projects? Well, some of them include recent efforts by North African filmmakers, writers, and scholars to reevaluate and celebrate the contributions that Berbers made to Al-Andalus. This is what I call the Berber Al-Andalus. And just last month at the Alhambra in Granada, they opened a new exposition that's called Alhambra and the Berber Universe. And so this is a kind of hot topic in Spain and Morocco right now. Another project would be efforts to imagine Al-Andalus as a place of exceptional freedom and creativity for Arab and Muslim women. This is what I call the feminist Al-Andalus, trying to imagine a feminist heritage that does not necessarily run directly through the feminist movements of Europe and the United States, a kind of indigenous feminism, and Al-Andalus has played a really significant role in that. Or the projects of works that use Al-Andalus as a model or metaphor to understand conflict and coexistence in the context of Israel-Palestine. This is what I call the Palestinian Al-Andalus. There's a chapter in my book for each of those projects, but before anyone takes a look at their watch and panics, I'm not going to walk you through each of those case studies. I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the directions in which my book goes, and maybe also to suggest some topics that we could take up in the Q&A. I would like to conclude today by looking at one quote from my chapter on the varied uses of Al-Andalus in Israel-Palestine. It's actually, I would say, since the 1930s, Al-Andalus has frequently been paired with Palestine as kind of two lost paradises that fell to a foreign occupier of a different faith. This is a very significant undercurrent that appears all over the place in modern Arabic literature. And the chapter is in part about that, but it's actually much more. Al-Andalus functions in weird ways in Israel-Palestine, and so it's about other things too. But today I'm just going to give you a little snippet. And this quote comes from the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, perhaps the most famous 20th century Palestinian poet. And in particular comes from an interview that Darwish did with the French newspaper Le Monde in January of 1983. When the interviewer asked Darwish to talk about his childhood, the interview question is, tell me about your childhood, Darwish responded with the following intriguing statement. Now, mind you, as I read this is the answer to the question, tell me about your childhood. My childhood, it's not just mine. It's a collective childhood. Its place does not evoke Al-Andalus because this has been lost forever. There was nothing about Al-Andalus in the question. Al-Andalus is no longer a place. It is a psychological state. As for Palestine, it is my childhood. It is an achievable paradise, not a lost paradise. When I speak about it, and I speak about it a lot, it is to get my hands back on that which was the origin of my existence. In this sense, Palestine is not a memory, but rather an existence, not a past, but rather a future. Palestine, it is the aesthetics of Al-Andalus. It is the Andalus of the possible. So I love this quote as an answer to the question, tell me about your childhood. So to unpack it, first I should say that Darwish is playing with one of the most common nicknames used to describe Al-Andalus in modern Arabic writing, the lost paradise, Al-Firdaus al-Mafqud. This is a nickname for Al-Andalus that's been in circulation since the early 20th century. However, Darwish insists that Palestine, unlike Al-Andalus, is not a lost paradise. Rather, it is a once and future paradise. It is, to use his words, the Andalus of the possible. What I like about this passage is its complex temporality, a temporality that tells us something about the multifarious and slippery ways in which Al-Andalus operates in modern memory and culture. Here, Al-Andalus is not merely a past onto which we project our present concerns, nor is it merely a past that is repeated in the present in a kind of cyclical and endless loop of cyclical history. Rather, Al-Andalus is a past that holds out the promise of potential futures. It is a past that is not past, but also is not present, and yet might be future. In my reading, Darwish is both using and bridling against the common equation of Palestine and Al-Andalus. To equate them, he suggests, is to renounce Palestine, to relegate it to the past. And yet he does not entirely abandon the equation. He suggests that the power of Al-Andalus, like the power of Palestine, resides in the future, a future that is possible, if not yet fully articulated. I wanted to end on this quote from Darwish because I think that it points toward the larger conceptual stakes of my project, a project in which I'm trying to think through the politics, ethics, and limits of using the past to understand the present and to imagine the future. The simplest but least satisfying way of formulating this project would be to think of it as an exercise in debunking, an exercise in which I identify over and over again the anachronism that often characterizes our modern understanding of Al-Andalus. After all, calling out anachronism is in fact the most common strategy that most scholars use, either to decry, deride, or just simply ignore many modern evocations of Al-Andalus. Oh, Al-Andalus is not really about Al-Andalus, boring, I'm moving on. But I think that if we're too quick to cry anachronism, then we run the risk of losing sight of a much more interesting set of questions, such as, what are the specific cultural or political needs that Al-Andalus serves in the context at hand? Clearly, the Andalus of the possible that Darwish is talking about is not the Andalus of white Arabness that Zaidan is talking about. Under what historical and cultural conditions does it become possible to talk productively about Al-Andalus? As we saw in the case of the Fairuz concert, or heard in the case of the Fairuz concert, geographic or temporal proximity is certainly not, those aren't prerequisites. We can be very far away from Al-Andalus and still use it productively. Finally, how can we map the modern memory of Al-Andalus in a way that is both cohesive and heterogeneous? That is, in a way that accommodates contradiction without falling into the cynical position that says Al-Andalus means everything and nothing at the same time. In short, acknowledging anachronism, I think, should be the starting point rather than the end point of our discussion. I also think that Andalus anachronism, in its persistence, in its resilience, in its ability to mold itself to such diverse contexts, it must be telling us something about what we want from the past, what we need from the past. And this is the larger question that I'm grappling with right now. The question that I hope will make this project relevant to scholars who are working on memory politics in other contexts. I'd welcome any suggestions that you have about that part of the project or about anything else that I've presented today. For now, I just want to thank you again for your interest in my work, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.